Which players are getting traded at the trade deadline? Which names do you need to pay attention to? Coming up very soon in this live stream, we're going to discuss some big time trade deadline targets and landing spots for the top available players. I'm specifically targeting players to fit needs for the top contenders out there, the buyers at the trade deadline. We're talking about teams that think they can make a run this NFL season and players that have been widely discussed to be traded. So many of these players have already been mentioned out there, and you probably have heard some rumors about these players, but trying to identify which players actually make the most sense for these teams. So let me know in the comments what you guys think about these moves, these trades. If you think logically it makes sense, if you think you would love it for your football team, if they added this player, this position, let us know in the comment section. Let's get started, guys, with the first trade at the trade deadline. We've already had a couple, but this one would be a splash and a statement by the Los Angeles Chargers. If they traded for wide receiver Diontae Johnson could possibly fix and solve the greatest weakness of the Chargers offense and maybe even team, their wide receiver position. I think many people would argue that last Monday night, they lost to the Cardinals because their receiving core was absolutely horrific, and they were relying on receivers that were cut by the Patriots. And yes, guys, I'm wearing the Patriots logo today because I only have a couple of Mondays in a year where I can wear my Patriots gear. But I'll promise you this, okay? We'll talk about each team that needs to make a trade here, including the Chargers. And the Chargers are a team that had Jalen Reagor fumble the football on Monday Night Football. This past week, yes, they get a nice win against the Saints, but that's the Saints with a backup quarterback. It was comfortable. They beat the Panthers in a similar fashion. But if the Chargers want to level up, if they truly want to bolt up, if they want to be a team to actually be taken seriously in the AFC alongside the Chiefs in their own division, alongside the Texans, the Bills, the Ravens, then they need to make a move for a receiver. And Diontae Johnson gives them a player that can line up outside, so he's not the same to Ladd McConkey. I think a lot of Charger fans might not love this on the surface because they look at Diontae Johnson as a somewhat smaller framed receiver, and they think of smaller framed receivers as inside players, as guys that need to align in the slot. But Diontae Johnson's actually more of a perimeter player. He can really separate and get open. And something that we've seen from the Chargers receiving core is they moved on from Keenan Allen. They moved on from Mike Williams. I think a big reason they didn't want Mike Williams back was because he doesn't really bring that separation element. So while they could bring Mike Williams back for a reunion with Justin Herbert for that chemistry, I think they're looking for a specific type of receiver. Ladd McConkey was a specific type, route runner, separator, guy that gets open, guy that creates space in the offense, guy that can create something after the catch, had an incredible game against the Saints, but give him a veteran receiver, Justin Herbert, a guy that can get open, that can win off the line of scrimmage, that can actually get down the field, that can route up a corner and convert a big third down into a first down. Diontae has been a little inconsistent with his hands throughout his career, but the thing about Herbert is that ball placement is absolute superb every single time. So I think if you add Diontae Johnson to this offense with the run game that they have, the offensive line they have, Herbert at quarterback, Ladd McConkey playing as well as he is, the defense, the way that they're playing, I mean, this team could definitely be in contention with the rest of the AFC. They might not be a favorite, but I definitely feel like a dark horse would not be crazy to talk about with Diontae Johnson. 30 catches, 357 yards, 3 touchdowns on the season so far. And I think instantly would be the number one receiver for the Chargers and allow Ladd McConkey to continue to have great matchups in the slot because teams are going to start to catch on that he's really become that number one guy as a rookie for that team. Hayden says, any chance Johnson would go back to the Steelers? I just couldn't see it when I thought about it at first, but I was like, it just doesn't make sense to me because the Steelers moved on from him. They traded him. And there was friction there for a long time between Tomlin and Johnson and the front office and getting paid and the quarterback position with the team. I think that he would probably prefer to go somewhere else. And I also feel like the Steelers would probably steer away from Diontae Johnson. I could be wrong. I could be entirely wrong about that situation. It just didn't feel like those two were getting along at the end there. I'd gladly get rid of Johnson. He has effort issues, give up way too easily. I assume you're a Panthers fan. Keep pounding 59. Okay, that makes sense. Luke Kuechly, shout out. But Diontae Johnson, on a bad team, we've seen that throughout his career where he will kind of give up on plays and he needs to be motivated, inspired. I think you give him to a guy like Jim Harbaugh, who is an excellent leader of men who can get him motivated. You put him on a good football team with a great quarterback, who honestly he hasn't had really since like late stage of the career, Big Ben Roethlisberger. I think that would make him pretty motivated because at the beginning of the year for the Panthers, he played well and he had some really nice games. He's had nice games as close as like 2 weeks ago. So yeah, he's had some inconsistencies. I think you could factor in the team that he's on, the quarterback play that he's had, a roller coaster of different quarterbacks, Andy Dalton, Bryce Young. So I think you put him in a situation with a stable quarterback, a stable coach, a stable culture that they're building with the Chargers. You could give them a number one receiver for relatively cheap in Diontae Johnson. Moving to the second player and second trade that I love, the Detroit Lions need to add an edge rusher. Everybody knows they're going to be targeting edge rushers. And one that actually came out and said, I would love to play for the Detroit Lions because I want to play against the Vikings and I want to play against the Packers because he used to play for those teams. Why not another NFC North team? Za'Darius Smith traded to the Detroit Lions. This one makes a lot of sense as Za'Darius Smith has been one of the most consistent pass rushers in the NFL for, I don't know, it feels like 7 or 8 years now. He's done it on multiple teams, multiple schemes, Baltimore, Minnesota, Green Bay, Cleveland. We've talked about how Za'Darius Smith can play in different systems in previous streams where he can be a guy that is really good against the run, set the edge, which Detroit really covets from their edge rushers. He's also very talented in twists and games up front, and he's very, very active in terms of sacks. He's always seemingly putting up sacks, 5 sacks in 8 games so far this year, complementing Myles Garrett on the other side. He is 36th in PFF grade this year, 33rd in pass rush grade. In previous seasons, he ranked 16th and 13th the last 2 seasons in PFF grade. So a top 20 pass rusher the last 2 seasons. He's also top 20 in pressures, 19th. So this is about as good of an edge rusher as a team is possibly going to get at this point in the season. You're not going to land Max Crosby. That's unrealistic. You're not going to land Trey Hendrickson. That's unrealistic, right? These players are not going to go. Myles Garrett, he's not going to get traded by the Browns. He's a franchise caliber edge rusher in the prime of his career. But a guy that's a little bit older, a little bit more of a vet that is still playing at a high level is someone that teams can go after. And I don't think they're going to be able to replace Aiden Hutchinson, but the thing that the Lions should be able to do is find 1 or 2 guys that can play a role to help replace that production of Aiden Hutchinson. I think Smith can certainly do that in terms of being a well-rounded player, but specifically as a pass rusher. And with the amount that the Lions like to blitz, I think Smith would fit in the defense extremely well in those different blitz packages as well. Marquis says Falcons need Smith more. I don't know if they need him more, to be honest, because the state of the Lions defensive line without Aiden Hutchinson, it definitely lacks a number 1 pass rusher. I would say, though, the Falcons do need a pass rusher. I don't disagree with you. I just wonder at a certain point, like how many older guys are they going to add to their defensive line? It feels like they've got a retirement home with Matt Judon, Grady Jarrett, David Onyemata. You add Za'Darius Smith. You've got the average of 32 years old on your defensive line. So I think what they need to do is probably get to drafting some of these guys. But hey, I understand they're in contention this year. Will the Bears be active in the trade market? I do think the Bears will be active. I think specifically they'll be looking at offensive linemen. I don't necessarily think they'll be looking at like anything otherwise on offense. Maybe like D tackle or defensive line could be a possibility as well, but I wouldn't really foresee them going for safety or corner or linebacker. So maybe offensive line, defensive line. I definitely think they'll be somewhat active. I wouldn't think they're going to be super aggressive, but I think they'll make a trade if they want and if they have the opportunity. NFC North do love to recycle their players to each other. Smith to Detroit makes sense. Well, right now he's in Cleveland, so it's not like you're trading him within the division, but he would be headed back to the NFC North. And like I said, I've always been a fan of his game. I really think he's a super great player, underrated for many, many years in the NFL. So Za'Darius Smith to the Lions is my second landing spot. My third landing spot is a current Patriot headed inside the AFC to the Baltimore Ravens because they need some pass rush as well. A lot of teams need a pass rusher. Josh Uche is a former 11.5 sack man. He was a healthy scratch against the New York Jets. Why? Not because of his play, but because he could get traded. That's been the rumor, right? He's got an extremely affordable contract. It's only a 1-year contract. Barely makes anything in terms of those high-end pass rushers or guys that you can acquire. Josh Uche to the Baltimore Ravens. He only has 2 sacks this season, but we've talked about him before. He's the type of guy that can spark a pass rush, be a pass rush specialist. He's got a deep bag of tricks when it comes to a pass rushing specialist. He's got great quickness, great pop off the line of scrimmage. He can tie together different moves from the bend around the edge to spinning back to the quarterback. And I think he brings explosion, kind of like what they have in Owe, and a third player that they can add to their rotation. Currently, it feels like they just play Kyle Van Noy way too much. Kyle Van Noy is a really awesome player at this stage in his career, former Patriot as well, which also would kind of like equate to you maybe believing that it wouldn't be too hard of a transition for Josh Uche just because there might be similar translatable skills there within the systems as well, from Belichick's defense to the current incarnation of the Ravens. But Kyle Van Noy has 7 sacks and he's playing phenomenal football, but he is an older player. And as the season wears on, you're going to need him to rotate out of the lineup. So you bring in Josh Uche for third downs. You have 3 pass rushers with Owe, Van Noy, and Uche, who you can rotate together. And even Owe and Uche kind of sound similar, so it kind of works in my mind. But you could have a little bit more dynamic there for different athletes, different body types, different skill sets, right? So I think you could bring in another guy, and there's really no problem with ever adding depth to the defensive line. The way that these playoffs are, man, you need to be prepared to have depth. You need to have guys. A guy might go down, but situational football is very important. And adding a guy in situational football that can help you on third down, that can help you close a game, that can help you get a key pressure, key sack, that very talented in terms of his overall flexibility, quickness, his speed. He's very athletic, Josh Uche. Like he was coming out of the draft, he was actually like seen as a linebacker / edge rusher. He's that type of mold. And so he would be very well utilized in Baltimore's system, in my opinion, because they look for those type of athletes. The Owe's, the Van Noy's, very similar type of players. So yeah, Uche as a healthy scratch, I think almost certainly will be traded. I think Baltimore, in my opinion, is the best fit. I do wonder how he would transfer to a system like San Francisco or to a place like Detroit, because he isn't, the strongest guy in run defense, and he isn't really used to playing with his hand in the dirt on the line of scrimmage. He's more of a guy that stands up, kind of like what the Ravens typically do. So that's kind of where I lean towards Baltimore in terms of that addition. T. Anderson says, I like Arden Key to the Lions. Arden Key is an underrated name. I like Arden Key as well. I have for many years. I feel like he would be more of a situational player, though, in my opinion. And I think he's probably more of a third rusher. Like, I think Za'Darius Smith's a better player. I think Za'Darius Smith, if you could get a Za'Darius Smith, if you could get a Harold Landry, who we will discuss as well, those would be the type of players that I think Detroit really needs to kind of swing for, in my opinion. Those are guys that are a little bit more well-known for sacks, for for playing on every snap. I think Landry is a good player. I just think he's more of a compliment. If they still had Hutchinson, that would be the type of move that I would really like for them. Does Jordan Addison stay with Minnesota? He's a bit disgruntled. I think so. First of all, there's off the field things with Jordan Addison that I don't necessarily know other teams really want to buy into and potentially trade for. But I also feel like the Vikings are in contention. I'm not sure why they would make that move. He's still on a cheap contract. It just doesn't make sense. They'd rather figure it out. For my Lions, I say Smith and Uche together. Is that possible? Entirely possible for me in terms of them making multiple moves. We've seen that in years past where teams like the Eagles, teams like the Niners, teams that are really aggressive in the trade market, the Bills have made multiple trades in seasons, like going after players to try to make a run, like definitely possible. I think Detroit could make multiple moves. I think definitely for edge rusher would be the specific position, because otherwise I don't really know another position. Maybe corner, but like I doubt it at this point. So yeah, if they're going to make multiple trades, it would be at edge rusher. True Visions says Miami, New Orleans, Tennessee need to be sellers at this point. I agree. They would all be on my sellers list. The thing with figuring out the sellers and the buyers is like a lot of the times, man, I was trying to figure out like, okay, which players can go where? And it's like, well, this team in their same division needs this position. And that's kind of frustrating about trying to figure that out. But yeah, Miami, there's a lot of players there. Calais Campbell is one to look out for, I think. New Orleans, low key, I kind of think that Marshawn Lattimore could be traded. I wouldn't be shocked by that. Tennessee, I don't think Jeff Simmons will be on the market. I could see maybe like a veteran lineman like Daniel Brunskill being on the market. Also, Harold Landry, somebody like that. Just throwing out names that I think make sense contract-wise and situation-wise. Next up, Mike Williams. Feels like he's supposed to get traded at any point. Maybe thought he was going to be traded already. Mike Williams to the Pittsburgh Steelers is the location for me. They just played the Jets, so I'm sure they maybe talked to Mike Williams or perhaps got in contact with the Jets about a potential trade. The Steelers looked very impressive on that Sunday night game. Now, I guess that's a little bit less impressive now that we kind of look at the Patriots beating the Jets as well, but they play on Monday Night Football, so obviously they were not going to make a move before this game. Maybe Tuesday, Wednesday, somewhere in that range. Like Tuesday, they could make a move. So I feel like Mike Williams, the reason I like him in Pittsburgh is Arthur Smith typically likes big receivers. He likes jump ball receivers. Arthur Smith is a guy that drafted Drake London, for example. He brought in guys even like Mac Hollins, who played a ton of snaps for the Atlanta Falcons in years past. And Mike Williams is a big receiver who can go up and he can bring down the football. And the thing that I love about that is Russell Wilson. Those are the type of receivers that he just plays really well with, because Russell Wilson has that famous moon ball. He throws the ball straight up in the air, and then a receiver that can high point the ball and come down with it is very effective in that offense. George Pickens already is that type of receiver, but I think George Pickens still has a yak threat. He has a little bit more of a route running tree to his game. I think Williams, at this point in his career, right now, coming off the injuries and stuff, he doesn't have a lot of agility to his game, a lot of separation to his game. He never really did. But I think still we've seen him this season make some incredible catches, some one-on-one catches, some fade catches, things like that. So if you have him isolated on the number 2 corner as George Pickens is taking a lot of the coverage on one side of the field, I feel like Mike Williams could still thrive on the other side on a team that doesn't necessarily need Jerry Rice or Randy Moss, right? They just need a little bit of an upgrade, a veteran receiver who knows what he's doing, who can go out and line up out wide specifically. They have guys that you feel like could play in the slot, right? They've got little Calvin Austin. They've got Van Jefferson. They've got guys like that who can contribute and maybe be kind of shifty underneath targets, but they don't have another perimeter wide receiver that can line up out wide and make some plays with their size, their frame. Pickens is really the only guy. So you add that to the Steelers offense, it makes them a little bit better. right? They've got a pretty good running game right now. Their offensive line is playing better and trending up. They've got multiple tight ends that they utilize. They've got a very strong defense. Russell Wilson looked really good in his debut. They can add another receiver that is the type of skill set that complements Russ very well in Mike Williams. It would make perfect sense to me. Denver, a sleeper for Lattimore? I don't think so. I actually think Denver's secondary has played exceptional. So I don't really think that's an area that they would target, in my opinion. I could be wrong. Obviously, I see where you're going with that, just the Saints connection between Sean Payton and Marshawn Lattimore. But honestly, man, I don't think you guys need a cornerback, but that's just my opinion. I wouldn't like Williams to the Steelers. He wouldn't resign in the offseason. He's nowhere near what he was. Not worth the pay, says Busboy. Okay, so it's a 1-year, $10 million contract that he's currently signed on. So basically, he would be playing on your team this year. Russell Wilson is also on a 1-year contract, Busboy. So basically, you're just looking at this season and trying to fill a need for this season. I don't necessarily think that you're looking at the long term. I did think of a lesser name in terms of profile, but Darius Slayton is one that I would also look out for. I actually think Darius Slayton's a better player than Mike Williams right now. I don't know if that's a hot take or not, but Darius Slayton's actually really underrated. Look out for him as well. I think that he could be moved by the Giants. So if the Steelers want more of a speed threat, then that could be somebody. He also plays on the outside that they might target. But I definitely think the Steelers are going to go after a receiver. I just felt like Mike Williams made perfect sense with the type of receiver that Russell Wilson benefits from and works well with, kind of like Courtland Sutton. Thoughts on the value of Darius Slayton? There you go. That was kind of crazy. I didn't even know that comment was coming up. Darius Slayton, I think that he's good, man. Like he's had 700 yards, like 3 or 4 consecutive seasons. He's led the Giants in receiving yards for 3 or 4 consecutive seasons. He won't this year because of Malik Neighbors, but he's a good player. I love his speed. I think he's one of the deceptive, fast receivers in football. He can get down the field. He can run by a cornerback. He's a great deep threat. I think he's also, pretty good on like crossing routes and things like that. He doesn't have the best hands in the world. He's not the best contested catch guy, but he can create separation and he can get down the field. And he's proven that he can have success with bad offenses, bad quarterback play, and still be reliable and kind of fill a multitude of roles. He's kind of that number 3 for the Giants right now, but I think he could be a number 2 on some teams, especially like Pittsburgh, where they have a run-oriented system and they're a defensive-led team. You sprinkle in a little speed from Darius Slayton. That could be a different type of deep threat that Pickens maybe doesn't provide. Pickens is more of kind of a big-bodied jump ball guy, but Slayton could maybe add a speed element, just for an example there. Maybe a team like the Chargers would also take a look at him as well. Moving to the next one, we've got Brandon Scherff, a veteran offensive lineman. I think he could be on the move because it's his last year on his contract in Jacksonville. Jacksonville is terrible. They have 2 wins at this point in the season, and they're not making the playoffs, clearly, even in the AFC South. So he could be on the move as a well-respected veteran that pretty much has played well his entire career. A team may need an upgrade on the interior of their offensive line. Now, I thought of multiple teams for this one, but I ultimately decided with the Minnesota Vikings. I thought about the Bears. I thought about the Texans, but the Texans are in the division, and the Bears, I feel like they still have Nate Davis on the roster getting paid, so I wasn't exactly sure they're going to be willing to do a trade like that, but I went with the Vikings, and part of the reason that put it over the top is Christian Darrisaw went down on Thursday Night Football, and you might be saying, Mitch, Christian Darrisaw's left tackle, Brandon Scherff's a right guard. Yeah, I get it, but it's still an offensive lineman, and it's still an upgrade to the offensive line that could help the rest of the offensive line. So part of the problem when you lose a tackle like Christian Darrisaw, one of the great things that a Christian Darrisaw provides is the fact that you never have to double his side of the offensive line. You don't have to worry about helping Christian Darrisaw because he's that good. So he takes on the guy pretty much the entire game, the same guy the entire game, right? So you isolate him. But with Brandon Scherff, if you strengthen another area of your offensive line, perhaps it allows you to help to another area of your offensive line and maybe negate the loss of Christian Darrisaw. Because you're not trading for a left tackle of the level of Darrisaw, who was lost on Thursday Night Football. You're not going to go out and get Tristan Wirfs or Trent Williams. That's not going to happen, right? Andrew Thomas is out for the year. Jordan Mailata's injured. You're not going to get a left tackle of that level of player, right? So an offensive guard like Scherff, who's played in a lot of different teams, a lot of different systems, he currently ranks 40th overall by PFF, 19th in pass block, which is pretty important. And that's kind of more what Minnesota covets. He also ranked 20th last season, according to their grading. Scherf would play right guard and upgrade the Vikings' weakest position on their offensive line. Ingram has been awful this year and past seasons, and teams that have been able to pressure guys like Kirk Cousins and Sam Darnold have targeted Ingram specifically and have put their best interior pass rusher over top Ingram and have been able to just feast from that mismatch. So if you strengthen the right guard position, it's not like Ingram makes too much money, so you could just make him the backup or one of the reserves on your offensive line for the interior, bring in Brandon Scherf to be a starter, and that would strengthen your interior, I think, greatly, because they're bringing back their left guard. That's also going to help. Bradbury's been solid at center. Right tackle O'Neal is a very good player. You strengthen right guard, all of a sudden it helps you help to the left side and negate the loss of Christian Darrisaw. So Brandon Scherf to the Vikings. Look out for the Bears and the Texans as well, potentially. Will the Commanders be buyers this year? The Commanders will be buyers this season, and I'm specifically going to talk about a player that I think they will and should target. That is an edge rusher, Harold Landry of the Tennessee Titans. The Commanders could make a move on defense. I think corner is a possibility, but I ultimately landed with edge rusher because I think that there's not a ton of corners that are on the market that they would be willing to aggressively pursue. Like I brought up Lattimore before, and that could be maybe something they look out for. J.C. Horn has been rumored. Like a shutdown number one corner or that capacity or that level is possible. But Landry is a player that's been 10 sack seasons, like multiple times in his career. He has 4 sacks so far this season. He's ranked 44th via PFF, and he's also a great run defender, 8th in run defense. Now, Dan Quinn loves to have a great edge rotation. He loved it in Atlanta. He loved it in Dallas. Currently, he has 2 former Cowboys suiting up as starters for the Commander defense. Dante Fowler, who's actually playing above expectation for the contract that he's been given, and Dorrance Armstrong, who's been very productive as their number 1 pass rusher on the edge. They lost Jonathan Allen, who's one of their best players on their entire team. So they definitely need to think about strengthening their pass rush, especially, if you're going to take on these NFC powerhouse offenses in the playoffs. A player like Landry, who can contribute as a run defender and also a sack artist, would be massive for this defense. I think they could definitely utilize a corner, but Quinn's really creative with his edge rushers. He's really good at scheming up pressure. Landry's been in, Tennessee his whole career. He was a late first round pick. He might have been like the 32nd pick, the 30th pick, something like that. But he's been thriving his entire career as a guy that's been in defenses that throw out a lot of dynamic looks, a lot of simulated pressures. I think in Washington, he could fit right in with Dan Quinn, provide a guy that can play on all 3 downs and maybe lessen the load of Dante Fowler to the degree where Fowler could more be what he's supposed to be, just kind of like a pass rushing specialist, similar to like a Josh Uche player, instead of playing on rundowns as well. And that could make your entire D-line better, where you're playing players more in their strengths and their niche roles, as opposed to on every snap or working them too much. Next up, and our final landing spot for the top available players, I wanted to put a corner on this list, and one that's constantly been rumored is Greg Newsome. It's hard to find corners that are being rumored because corner is a very thin position, and oftentimes teams need 3 corners to really have a good cornerback group. The Browns happen to have 3 corners that were highly touted, well-regarded, and one that has not been paid by Cleveland is Greg Newsome. Greg Newsome out of Denzel Ward, who's like a top 3 corner or 4 corner in the NFL, in my opinion, an absolutely phenomenal player. Martin Emerson, who had a great year last year, has been up and down this year, has been paid, both those players. But a guy that has not been paid is Greg Newsome. And Greg Newsome is interesting, and I think he'll be coveted by teams because he was a former high draft pick. He also can play inside or outside. He's played 183 snaps in the slot and 182 snaps out wide. So he's actually been able to show throughout the course of his career he can play out wide and in the slot. He's also shown that he can play in Cleveland, specifically zone heavy type of, defenses where he's in the slot or out wide, more zone or more man with the current incarnation of the Browns. So he's played in a lot of different spots. He's played in different systems. So I think that's going to make him transferable to a lot of different teams. A team that makes sense to me is the Packers. The Packers are a team that I think they have an excellent number one corner in Jaire Alexander, who's continuing to play great football this year. I don't think he really gets enough respect for the amount that he actually upgrades that team when he's playing. But on top of that, their number 2 and their number 3 corner are relatively weak. I mean, Keyshawn Nixon has been playing a lot of snaps, and he's like really known for his return ability. And Eric Stokes has just been disappointing in general. So if they were able to upgrade one of their cornerback spots, I think that would be massive. And Newsome could really allow them to decide where they want to upgrade. He could play inside or outside. And depending on personnel, right, who you're facing, because some teams will have 12 personnel, right, or 11 personnel. So sometimes it will be two tight ends. Sometimes it will be 3 receivers. So depending on how many corners you want on the field, Newsome might play in the nickel on third down. He might play out wide on first down, right? So Newsome can provide some flexibility and depth at multiple spots for a team like the Packers, who are going to have to defend the pass at a certain point in the playoffs. And he's also had a little bit of transferable ability because I believe it's Joe Woods, who is his former defensive coordinator in Cleveland. Similar system to Hafley, I would say, in Green Bay as well. So there is some transferable traits. 6'1", pretty good size, showcases that he could play on the outside because a lot of teams like that size on the outside. I know the Packers like a decent amount of size there. That's part of the reason they drafted Stokes, but he could also play inside because he's quick, he's fast. So yeah, a little bit underwhelming this year, 101st in coverage grade, but overall as a player, he's been pretty solid. I wouldn't say he's a number 1 corner, but I would say he's definitely a good number 3 in Cleveland, but I would say he's a solid number 2. So that's the type of player that I think could definitely be added by the Packers for sure. Newsome to the Packers, help fill in with the injuries and solidify the secondary when healthy. I agree with that, man. And honestly, I couldn't actually find a lot of teams that needed corners, and I couldn't find a lot of corners that fit a lot of teams. The Packers were clearly the team out of all the contenders where I was like, they need a corner. They need a corner. And that's the position I think they might need the most out of all the positions. I think linebacker might be slightly sneaky, safety as well, but defense for sure. The Panthers should sell J.C. Horn to a corner needy team. Man, it's tough with the Panthers because they just don't have a lot of good players. Like, do you want to keep getting rid of good players? Brian Burns, got rid of him, right? Like, look at the team. They lost Derek Brown. They fall apart. Like, their defense is atrocious. Sure, they could use more draft picks and capital. I guess it depends on what a team is willing to give them. But at a certain point, you need good players. So Coach Laxer says Cowboys need help. Who do you recommend? Honestly, if I were the Cowboys, well, they're going to get their defensive players back. It's hard. It's going to be hard for them to find, I think, interior defensive linemen. That's been a position I think they've needed for years. Linebacker, I think they need as well. A defense, they definitely need to address. Deron Bland should be coming back soon. Micah Parsons, DeMarcus Lawrence should be coming back soon. Maybe they look for a linebacker. Running back is also a possibility, but I don't really think there's a running back out there. Maybe Travis Etienne would be pretty attractive, but other than that, like, there's like Miles Sanders. That's not really a significant upgrade. Wide receiver is actually, I think, a huge need. If they could somehow go out there and be aggressive and get Deontay Johnson, I think that would completely unlock their offense because they need another guy that can just win and get open against single coverage and just, I mean, they're throwing to Turpin and they're throwing to Jalen Tolbert. These guys are like 4s, in my opinion. Tolbert maybe a 3 at times, but CD is clearly their best target. And they don't really have anyone else that defenses have to respect. So for me, I would say that they need a receiver on offense. They need something to help their run defense in general on defense. So yeah, those are my thoughts for landing spots for top available players. Hope you guys enjoyed. It's Mitch. You can find me on YouTube for more content, The Bottom Line View. You can follow me here on Bleacher Report. I'll be back for more trade deadline discussion later in the day. I believe it's at 4 p.m. Eastern time, 1 p.m. Pacific. So I'll see you guys later discussing the top contenders and what they need. Recapping the list, Deontay Johnson, wide receiver of the Carolina Panthers, to bolt up with the Chargers. Zadarius Smith adds a pass rusher and replaces Aiden Hutchinson in Detroit. Josh Uche adds a spark to the pass rush of the Ravens. Mike Williams, another big targeted wide receiver for the Pittsburgh Steelers. They've been chasing a receiver forever, man. I just want it all to end. Please, just trade for a receiver so we can stop with the rumors. Brandon Scherff upgrades the Vikings subtly on the offensive line. Harold Landry to solidify the edge and give them potentially a long-term option for a young football team at defensive end for Dan Quinn. And Greg Newsome helps the Packers potentially go from good to great on defense. Thank you guys for watching. It's Mitch. We'll see you in the next one. Peace, guys.